I'm the Associate Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer. I use she, her, ella pronouns. We will be recording this session. And back when I was scheduling the topics for the semester, I knew I wanted to put COVID as our last one because lo and behold, I knew we would still be in the midst of it. And here we are, just as we're going into a lockdown. Today, I'm so excited to welcome an all-star panel of our campus experts and all of you. I also want to thank our graduate student researcher in the Office of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, Hala Alnajar, who is also a Big Cat hero, my personal Big Cat hero, but put this panel together. So I'm going to turn it over to her. And thank you for joining us and being in community with us. I hope you and your families are as well as can be expected.
Awesome. Thank you, Danya. As always, I work with an amazing mentor, so it gives me the opportunity to shine. I'm really excited today. We have an awesome panel. I'm going to start with just giving quick introductions for folks and the work that they do. We're going to save questions towards the end, but if questions come up during folks' presentations, feel free to throw them in the chat so that you don't forget them, and I'll be sure to address those. So today we have with us Dr. Whitney Laster-Pirtle. Whitney is an assistant professor of sociology and MacArthur Foundation chair in international justice and human rights at the University of California, Merced. She received her BA from Grand Valley State University and her MA and PhD at Vanderbilt University. At UC Merced, she has affiliations with public health and critical race and ethnic studies departments and directs the Sociology of Health and Equity Lab. Dr. Pirtle is an award-winning author, teacher, and mentor. Her research explores issues relating to race, identity, inequality, health equity, and Black feminist praxis. And she'll be leading us today in a conversation on the intersections of COVID and race. We also have Dr. Maria Elena de Trinidad Young. Dr. Young is a scholar of immigrant health whose research seeks to understand the impact of the U.S. immigration system on the well-being of immigrants and their families. Dr. Young focuses on citizenship and policy as systems of inequality to advance knowledge on health inequities based on legal status and how health inequities are driven by state and local policies. She'll be today sharing her recent findings from her study of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Latino immigrants in rural California. We also have with us Shara Coleman, who's a financial wellness coordinator. Shara is an MBA candidate at CSU Fresno. Previously founding the Money Management Center at CSU Fresno, Ms. Coleman currently serves as the founder and the coordinator of UC Merced's new Financial Wellness Center. Shara is an award-winning financial educator recognized for her philanthropy, economic justice, and financial empowerment within the Central Valley. Shara is passionate about protecting the environment and its wildlife. She believes that we are on this earth to display compassion and better the communities around us. Today, she'll be speaking on COVID-19's financial impact on students, their families, and how this may ultimately affect their student success. And last but not least, we have Jennifer Howes Owens, who's a senior instructional designer for academic and emerging technology. Jennifer is a senior instructional designer in the academic and emerging technologies unit of OIT. Most of her work involves supporting faculty integration of technologies that help with the teaching and learning process and offering best practices to support the equitable and inclusive delivery of content. Since joining campus in July, she has developed and co-led large faculty workshops and really enjoys working one-on-one to provide immediate solutions. She'll be completing her EDD in Educational Psychology and Technology this coming spring. And Jennifer today will expand on the conversation around accessible online engagement. And so I will begin sharing slides and we'll be starting with Dr. Pirtle.
Thank you so much for putting this session together and for the introductions, Hala. I'm excited to talk to you all today about COVID-19. As my probably too long bio says, I do work related to race and health from a sociological perspective. And early on in the pandemic, somewhat early on in the pandemic, I wrote an article about racial capitalism and how it relates to COVID-19 inequities. Well, really racial and ethnic disparities in COVID-19. And so that's where my talk is really coming from. And so it's coming from my expertise in that area, but also just being someone who was freaked out by the pandemic and paying attention to the early data that was coming out, where we saw that there were particular groups of people who were unequally harmed by the pandemic. So you can go to the next slide. So it is a global pandemic, and that means that everybody around the world is impacted. But what we do see is that some people have worse impacts than others. Some countries have worse impacts than others. And what our early analysis shows is that the more unequal a society is, the more unequal their health is as well. And looking at the US case and racial statistics, we really see that front and center. So the next slide is pulling from the APM research lab that has done really awesome work looking at data, racial and ethnic disparities in COVID-19 with the best data that they have available. Mind you, a group of like 80 senators had to appeal to the CDC or community health departments all across the United States to release data by race, because we thought we were seeing that particular communities were harmed, but we didn't have the data for a while. So this is the best sort of data that we have right now. And you can see early on in April that from the start of when we had data, you saw a small gap between white Americans who are that black solid blue line and Black Americans who are the solid green line. And what we have seen over time is that the amount of death rates, the death toll, has grown. It's grown for all people, especially in the United States. But what we also see is the gap has grown as well. And so Black and Indigenous Americans experience the highest death tolls, or what we would call a death gap, compared to all other groups. We are seeing a massive loss of life and unequal loss of that life as well. Their recent reports on the next slide suggest that Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Pacific Islanders have about 3 times higher the rate of dying from COVID-19 than white Americans. And the APM Research Lab also I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to go look. But you can disaggregate by state. And so I pulled California's today, and that's on the next slide. And what we do see, Black Californians are represented in the green bar. And across the state, Black people make up about 6% of the population. But you see a definitely disproportionate sort of death toll, and it is also highly impacting Pacific Islanders, our Latinx community, our Indigenous community, our Asian community. So yes, COVID-19 is a global pandemic. It's impacting all of us, but it's impacting some more than others. So as a sociologist, that has led me to explore why that's the case. Go ahead and hit the next slide. So in general, my research is interested in why some racial and ethnic groups suffer more from poor health. But in this moment, I'm asking, why are Black, Indigenous, and people of color dying at disproportionate rates from COVID-19? And the quick and easy answer that I'm going to give you all, I'm going to work through this as much as I can, as much as time allows. But the quick and easy answer is that it's not race, it's not racial differences across these groups. It's actually racism that is the explainer for why we are seeing these racial differences. That is because we consider race a social construction. It's a symbolic boundary that we have mapped across particular groups. We have categorized these, we have imbued meaning into them. So they become really meaningful and real in our interactions, but they're not real biologically. Really, and that matters for conversations around health, because we tend to think of things happening to our bodies as being biologically related, but race is not biological, it's social. And so when we see these differences across racial categories, we have to think about the social environment and the social systems that allows those differences to exist. And I would name that as racism. So I think this definition of racism is really helpful. A pattern of action in which one or more of the institutions of society has the power to throw on more burdens and give less benefits to members of one race than another in an ongoing basis. So especially if you're thinking about our health, think about just the wear and tear that burdens can have on you over time. And if we are in a global pandemic and you have more burdens across social institutions, you might be particularly vulnerable for the health effects of COVID-19, the negative health effects of COVID-19. And so when I'm talking to communities, my students, anybody about the racial differences in COVID-19, I encourage a real analysis of what we would call or identify as root cause analyses to these differences. So don't look at just like the bad apples in a tree, but you have to look at what is creating infecting the roots that bad apples exist. So we can't put a Band-Aid on COVID-19 to address the problem. We have to think about systemic root change. And so in that article that I wrote, I identified a few different, what I would call fundamental basic root causes of the racial differences in COVID-19 that really do a good job of detailing how racism matters. And so I'll walk through a few of these, and then if we have Q&A, we can talk about this more. So the first one is racial residential segregation. When I wrote my article, I was talking about Detroit. So this is a picture of Detroit. The old picture here is in Detroit in 1939, and the red areas were those areas that city officials, planners, realtors I had identified as, it's too small for me to see right now, but basically dangerous areas. And what that was coded language for areas with high populations of people of color. And if you look at Detroit today, and these same areas are still red, but the second map that's white is exposure to environmental toxins. So those people who were kind of forced and constrained in particular neighborhoods have endured multiple burdens over time from the 1930s because they were restricted in where they could live, what they could have access to. And here they are constantly exposed to more environmental toxins. And so their health is being harmed. What that means is, for instance, they are more likely to have high rates of asthma, type 2 diabetes, all of these things that are pre-existing conditions for COVID-19 and would make someone vulnerable. So it sets them up on a sort of historical path to be more vulnerable to a health crisis even happening today. But racial residential segregation is a good sort of snapshot to think about how systemic racism matters for health. So think about COVID-19. Think about what we have been told: to shelter safe in place. That means you need to have a safe shelter to do that. You have to wash your hands. You need access to water. And we know that places in Michigan like Detroit and Flint haven't had great access to water. You want to stay healthy so you're not going crazy. So you need access to green spaces so you can walk around in non-crowded areas. You also, it restricts the nutrition that you have access to. In places like New York that has been harmed, they rely on public transportation, or those people without means more so rely on public transportation that increases exposure. And also just think about the social stress of being in a community. People in Detroit that I know, people in New York said it was a constant toll of stress because you could hear sirens day in and day out, and stress wears and tears at our body. So I think racial residential segregation is like a microcosm to explain the ways in which multiple health burdens, multiple racialized health burdens might wear and tear on particular populations. In addition, there was research even in the Central Valley that suggests that areas with a higher population of residents who are Black and brown had longer wait times to even get tested for COVID-19. So I'm just going to introduce the names of the other mechanisms. I don't have time to talk about them next, but if you have more questions, I can talk about it. So the next is occupational status. Think about who is deemed as an essential worker, and especially those essential workers who don't have protections, like those people in the fields, meat packaging plant workers, bus drivers, mainly Black and brown communities, again, that are impacted and don't have protections. The next one is, detention, right? That is constrained to the highest degree. And we see high correlations in Chicago, for instance, about those who have been released and community spread about COVID-19. So ICE detention centers, we're in Prison Alley. Think about those communities that are most harmed. In addition, there is medical bias. There has been reports that Black Americans were more likely to be turned away with symptoms of COVID-19 when they went to get help. So we have to address the medical institution and those biases as well. And you can go to the final slide. So I guess one of the main takeaways: you have an unequal society, you're gonna have unequal health. And therefore, if you want to achieve health equity, you have to prioritize racial and health equity as well. Wait, if you want to, achieve equity overall, you really need to think about the intertwined nature between race and health equity. All right, thank you.
Thanks so much, Whitney. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Maria Elena de Trinidad Young.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Whitney. Such important work, and I really recommend her article for anyone who hasn't read it yet. It's a really powerful and a great framework for thinking about all these issues, and I think it's informed my work as I've been thinking about some of these issues, specifically as they relate to Latino immigrants here in our rural and agricultural region of the state. So my brief remarks will focus on identifying how Latino immigrants have been excluded from the policy responses to COVID-19, and some of the findings from my study, the GLIMA study, that look at the impact of those exclusions on well-being. So as many of you know, the San Joaquin Valley and other rural and agricultural regions of the state have been the hardest hit in terms of COVID infections. And as Whitney just showed, Latinos are disproportionately affected by both infection and mortality. And in our region and other rural regions of the state, we're already in areas that are medically underserved, that are economically disadvantaged, and we have a high proportion of workers who are in critical services like agriculture, service sector, care work. And so kind of naturally, one would think that there would be a need to address the well-being of this population at this time. Unfortunately, Latino immigrants have actually faced an incredible amount of exclusion from the different policy responses that we've seen over the last several months. And so turning to the next slide, I want to focus on, and that's actually quite small, sorry. I want to focus on just two specific examples and show you how policy responses that exclude immigrants are linked to their well-being. So what we see across the United States is that immigrant families have largely and categorically been excluded from policy responses to the pandemic because of legal status. And so two specific examples that I'll focus on today is one, the CARES Act offered a rather meager but still important economic stimulus to Americans across the country. However, any family that had a person who was filing taxes with what's called an ITIN, or an individual taxpayer identification number, any family that had just a single individual filing with this, this identification number was entirely excluded from receiving economic stimulus. And so this ITIN is for people who don't have a social security number. So this includes undocumented immigrants, but also a lot of liminally or kind of temporarily undocumented immigrants. And what this meant was that we have many families across the United States where the children were born here, or US citizens, perhaps a spouse or a partner had a green card or was a citizen, but just having one person in the family who is a ITIN filer excluded the entire family from an economic benefit. Another key example of how policy has excluded immigrants, and Whitney speaks to this perfectly, is that immigrants tend to cluster in workforces that are known to be immigrant-dominated workforces. And so what we've seen consistently is that immigrant-dominated workforces, despite being deemed essential services, have really continued to have essentially no or few workplace protections for their workers. So in the next slide, sort of giving you some information about how this has affected people, the Migration Policy Institute estimated that because of the exclusion of ITIN filers in the CARES Act, 15.4 million individuals across the United States did not receive the economic stimulus. So this includes people who otherwise would be eligible, but because they are in a mixed status family, were deemed ineligible. So, and they estimated in California, this was 1.5 million families. So this is an incredible amount of money that, again, while relatively modest compared to what other governments have done, still categorically excluded people because of the legal status of a family member. On the next slide, I highlight that, again, because of the lack of workplace protections for immigrant-dominated sectors, what we see is not only weak protections, but no enforcement of those protections. So the Cal Matters newspaper article that's on the right here highlights that while California made some efforts to expand protections, there was no real enforcement of those protections. So the state was sending letters to workplaces that had violations of worker protections. There was no actual inspections, just sort of alerting them, hey, do better, but there's no real muscle behind those protections. So kind of given this broader context, my research team launched what we call the Clima study. You can go to the next slide and I'll show you a quick map. And the goal of this study was to understand specifically how these policy exclusions are affecting the well-being of Latino immigrants in rural parts of the state. So we, over the summer, conducted interviews with Latino immigrants in Merced County, Tulare County, and Imperial County. And we'll be conducting a second wave sort of now during this, I guess now really third wave of the pandemic, starting in January. And we'll be doing interviews in Fresno and Ventura counties to understand how the evolving policy climate during this time has excluded immigrants and the impact on their well-being. And so first what we found, and again, not entirely surprising, is that on the next slide, thank you, the exclusion of immigrant families from any sort of economic stimulus has left them in a situation of severe financial insecurity. The quote here from one of our participants, Maria, says, the government gave $1,200. I didn't get them. The agencies are giving money, but they never get your call. You call. And this quote really speaks to not just the facts of the exclusion, but this sense of frustration and even what we heard, a real sense of discrimination that immigrants are experiencing when they see that they are categorically excluded from the IRS stimulus and the other forms of support that have been set up for immigrants through charitable sources. And the state of California also had a small program. Were so overwhelmed by applicants that it was impossible to actually even obtain the funds. And so what this means is that immigrants are really left with no additional financial support during this time. On the next slide, I show that as a result of this severe financial insecurity, immigrants were having a hard time feeding their families. And because of the exclusion due to legal status, what we are finding is that immigrants are largely dependent on charity services. In rural parts of our state, there are already very limited kind of options for these different charity services. So for example, food banks or churches that are giving food. But also what we are finding is that even to obtain those services is time consuming and costly. So for example, we heard from many people that the Salvation Army would come once a month to their community. But to be able to obtain the food that was being distributed that one time each month, they had to coordinate transportation, which was a costly, expensive gas, and arrive hours in advance to line up for the food. And so for working families, this is again kind of another barrier even to obtaining these charity services. And then in the workplace, on the next slide, what we found was that on the whole, almost all of our participants reported that their employers were not actively implementing or enforcing any sort of COVID protection guidelines. And what this meant was that immigrants were both at risk in the workplace, but it also had a huge impact on their financial well-being because they were actually purchasing PPE with their own limited funds. Again, so people are buying their own PPE to be safe in the workplace. And because of this insecurity, they were worried about speaking up because they couldn't afford to lose their jobs. So kind of bringing this all together, what we see on the last slide, thank you, is that Latino immigrants, they're doing their best to stay safe in the workplace, to stay at home and socially distance with their families, but they're doing it with no significant policy support because of the exclusion, because of their legal status. And this is taking a toll on their food security, their mental health, and their sense of well-being and belonging in this country. So I look forward to the Q&A, and if you have any kind of questions about our study, I want to thank our fabulous team, and excited to hear the next person. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Elena. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Shara Coleman on the financial impacts of COVID-19.
Thank you, Hala. So everyone, I'm going to just go over briefly what and thank you, Dr. Young. I feel like that was a perfect, and Dr. Pirtle, I feel like both of those were perfect setups to what I'm going to talk about, because when we talk about student success, students aren't the student experience isn't in a vacuum, right? So that what's happening in their families and what's happening in their own lives is how they show up for classes, how they show up when they talk to you about the services that you offer if you're staff. So it's important to know that background of what's actually happening behind the curtain in these students' lives outside of their identity as students. So next slide. So I want to just briefly go over what a financial shock is, because when we talk about the financial impact that COVID-19 is creating for a lot of folks, it is actually financial shock. So what we call that in the industry is an unexpected financial obligation. It's an expense, or it's usually a reduction of income, and it's a substantial amount that will impact the individual or family in a way that they're unable to recover from it quickly. So some examples are car repair, job loss, and then illness is actually twofold. You can see that illness, not only do you have medical expenses, but you also get lost wages. So we're seeing in this time of pandemic, a lot of financial shocks are being created for folks, and it's the root cause. Well, as Dr. Pirtle says, we need to look at the root cause analysis of all of these things. This isn't just happening to students because, and so in some of the future slides, I'll discuss it. Next slide. So looking at pre-COVID, as a country as a whole, we weren't doing great at being able to cover the expenses to come up with, to cover a financial shock in our lives. So about 40% of adults reported not being able to come up with even $400. That even includes credit. So that's cash or credit, any type of liquid asset, to cover or pay for a financial shock. So they would need to come up with it some other way, or borrow money, or not be able to afford that financial shock. And then again, pre-COVID, 1 in 4 Americans were reporting that they skipped medical treatments due to their cost, which was, again, this is quite disarming, because this is all pre-COVID. So after COVID, or in our COVID era, the pandemic era, we're finding that 61 Americans are saying that their emergency funds, so what they would use to pay for that financial shock, is going to be exhausted either this month, November 2019, or has already been exhausted. And then 1 in 3 Americans, so going back to the statistic, the same survey, renewed their survey in 2020, and 1 in 3 Americans now are skipping their medical treatments due to COVID, due to the cost. So that's, again, a little bit alarming, because this is not only going to affect folks now, but it's going to affect the future, because they're pushing off treatments that are essential to them and to their health for the future. Next slide. So I just want to remind everyone that our campus is almost 2/3 of our campus is first-generation college students. A very important distinction to make, because when some of these percentages I'm going to give you and the statistics, they're probably going to be a lot higher when you look at our students, because of that intersectionality of being a first generation, and then also considering that 64% of our campus is Pell Grant recipients. So again, we're dealing with first gens, we're dealing with a lot of different layers and intersections that are driving these numbers, what they look like on our particular campus, up. And in the next slide, I want to go over the pandemic, what I call the pandemic financial dominoes, because these are some things that students were already struggling with, but then the pandemic is definitely making these numbers more volatile, and we're seeing a lot of economic volatility with these things. So number one, the first domino to fall, I would say, is the unemployment rate, as we all know, but then we're also seeing reduced hours at work. Maybe folks are getting a pay cut because their employer can't afford to pay them, or they just have to lay them off. And then that in kind is reducing the individual ability to pay their rent or their mortgage. And this is specific to college students. Pre and post COVID, about 46% of college students are reporting to be housing insecure in the past year. And just last year in 2019, about 17% nationally experienced some sort of homelessness. So you can tell what type of reality this is showing for students. And then 40% of college students were already food insecure, reported being food insecure in the last 30 days. So again, this is something that we're seeing as a result of their reduced hours or unemployment, either of them or their parents. I know a lot of students that I talk to personally have stepped up as the breadwinner in their household. It's all of these things are coming into play. So in the next slide, I want to just point out that look into this. I won't have enough time to talk about what this actually means for us as a community, but it's a little disheartening that almost 150%, payday lenders account for about 150% more than Starbucks and McDonald's combined in Merced. So we have about 14 payday lenders in Merced alone, and then 5 McDonald's and 5 Starbucks. So what is that saying? Given that we are financially unstable due to the pandemic in this community, what will that mean for the future, and how are we seeking to fill in those gaps to cover those financial shocks? Next slide. So I just want to, this slide, I basically wanted to note that the pandemic isn't over once we find a vaccine. So we are going to find, once the pandemic, we think it's behind us, right? We're going to have a little bit of a, what we call an economic hangover due to the pandemic. And what we've seen in the previous pandemics is that this can last quite some time. This can last for a couple decades at times, depending on how it's impacting that particular society. So you can see here that this can mean damage to creditworthiness. Maybe folks are either missing or skipping their payments, or they're overutilizing their credit. Our ability to buy houses and save and invest is deeply impacted. And then we're seeing the lower rates of return because either folks aren't investing back into the stock market, so you aren't getting the same return on investment in the past, or it could potentially mean that everyone is a little bit frightened right now, so they're trying to save up for those reserves to cover an additional financial shock, and so they're saving more, or it can be a combination of those two things. So in the next slide, I want to discuss how this is impacting financial success. So a lot of us in higher ed already know stress and basically stress, but also reduced scarcity can increase your executive functioning. So if you lower your stress, then you're going to increase executive functioning. You're going to do better in your classes. You're going to do better in school. And then an increase in scarcity, thinking that there's a scarcity of finances or of resources, you're not going to do as well, right? So if you are able to save money, you're going to feel like you have more financial control. You're going to feel like you have a greater sense of agency over your future, and you're probably going to do better in your classes. Next slide. Oh, next slide. So I want to go over briefly how we can support our Bobcats. I know some of you have high touch positions on campus with students, especially faculty, right? You all have probably the most face time with students. So I wanted to give you some options and some suggestions on how we can support our students, because they are suffering. Let me just tell you, I meet with a lot of them one-on-one in our financial coaching sessions, and they are suffering. So how do we support that? Well, number one, I want to offer my bit.ly to my coaching sessions, and I'll have that at the last slide as well, and we'll drop it in the link. So if you have a student that is in financial duress, then obviously reach out to me, and we can get them the support that they need, and we can work with the Dean of Students Office Basic Needs. Also, in the future, we can partner and collaborate on future curriculum design or offer resources to your class as a whole that can financially empower them. Next slide. And then I wanted to remind everyone that kindness is free. I just want to also remind everyone that there's resources on campus to financially empower your students. The Financial Wellness Center is one of them. I like to end with this little statement on all these things, because I want to just reiterate that our students are hurting right now. We're all here to help our students and to help them graduate and be successful in the future. And so getting them through this pandemic is just one of those other parts of that. So I wanted to offer my contact information as we support our students in this way. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shara, for the resources as well. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. Please bear with me as I pull up my PowerPoint. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Howes-Owens. I am a senior instructional designer in the Academic and Emerging Technologies office in the Office of IT. I'm still pretty new to campus, and although I'm new, myself and the members of the team, and even some of our partners in CETL, the Center for Educational Technology and Learning, spend a lot of time working with faculty on engagement. And I should actually extend that to students and staff. We have lots of conversations with all groups. And today we just wanted to put together a conversation to talk about community and bringing people together in a time when many can feel very isolated. So Shara's presentation really covered some of the word cloud that I have presented here. So some words that come around campus that you hear a lot are Zoom fatigue, juggling priorities, anxiety, lots going on in your household, cabin fever from being in the house all day. And so we also may ask, well, how does a conversation about accessibility relate to COVID-19? Well, in this time, we are rethinking the way in which we engage in the online setting. And so I just want to offer a few tools. Oops. So what I want to talk about today is a term, inclusive design. A week or so ago, my manager, Joan Holmquist, the director of Academic and Emerging Technologies, sent an article through EDUCAUSE, or from EDUCAUSE. And I haven't printed anything out in the months that I've been working from home, but as you can see here, I printed out the article because it's so awesome. And in the article, it defines inclusive design as design that considers the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, age, and other forms of human difference. And I wanted to share that because really all of us here in this meeting are designers. We're all design meetings, lead meetings, attend meetings, and I want to offer ways in which we can think and acknowledge difference when coming together. As you notice here, maybe you haven't, but I have subtitles that are running here along the bottom. And so sometimes people are not always in a position to hear an entire lecture or meeting. However, maybe reading it is another opportunity to offer someone to participate and stay engaged with what you're presenting. And the final thing that I want to say is on this topic is that a lot of times when we hear the word accessibility, we think accommodations. You think of the office, and if for those who are maybe have a K through 12 background, you think of IEPs and special education, but really accommodations are the formalized kind of plans that are developed for people with learning differences. But really accessibility is about creating multiple means of representation for all who come into a space. So how can we use the tools that we use every day in our daily lives to be more inclusive and equitable? This may seem a little strange, but hear me out. The suggestion that I actually learned when I first started in the IT office is that you actually create space to be off topic. So create a space to have a random conversation. We have Slack is what we use in IT, and there's a channel that we call Random. It's a channel dedicated to non-work topics. You may post GIFs or memes or different jokes you may have heard. And in this type of space, when you feel that you are in Zoom meetings all day, it's a great opportunity to kind of look at another channel in the computer and catch up on what your colleagues may be talking about. And think of it as kind of being in place of the office cooler talk that may happen, or if you run into a colleague in a hallway that you're no longer able to do right now. And even in meetings, we suggest to schedule time to talk about anything other than what's the topic of the meeting. Again, may seem a little counterproductive, but really sometimes people just would like 5 minutes to kind of bounce around ideas about different things or talk about things that are not specifically related to work. And so that's a way in which you can provide space to hear about what is going on with others in a similar way that would happen when you were on campus. And then finally, I have a slide here to direct you to use subtitles similar to how I'm using them today. So simple as starting your slideshow in your PowerPoint. I should say that this is for either the online version, which is offered through our Office 365 accounts, or in a version, I believe it's 2016 or after, there is a subtitle settings option, and you can select the language that's spoken and the language received. They don't have to be the same thing if you have an international audience. And then also you can decide where you would like the words to appear. And as you can see here, they are on below slide. Give you a chance to screenshot that if you're interested, but of course you can reach out and we can have a deeper convo. And then finally, something we like to always share in our office is that touch points and opportunities like this are the beginning, what we hope to be the beginning of conversations, not the end of conversations. So I always like to share that we have one-on-one consults. It doesn't have to be just for faculty, but there are staff who engage with faculty as well and students, and we would be happy to meet with you as well. We offer many workshops and many resources, and we are very much happy to meet and be thought partners and help you design your experiences. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I think the conversation of accessibility is really huge right now in this online world. And thank you to all of our panelists. I think this is, as I had hoped, a very well-rounded discussion, because COVID itself does not exist in a vacuum, but inequality also especially does not exist in a vacuum, and all of these versions of inequality that impact the effects of COVID really intersect with each other. So thank you to everyone and for your expertise. So I want to open up to questions. We've got about 18 minutes, which, as I'd hoped, we'd have plenty of time since we've got 4 amazing panelists. So feel free to throw questions in the chat or raise your hand, unmute, whatever you feel comfortable doing.
I didn't want to be the first, but maybe I'll get the party started. So one of the things I've been thinking a lot about in our work is, yes, while COVID has exposed maybe some issues of inequity, systemic racism, all those things that a lot of us have experienced, what in your expertise or research would you say should remain, right? As we're thinking about, there's much, like what strategies, what things have been uncovered that we should continue, right? And kind of like, if you were putting together a white paper, what would it be that you'd say, all right, during this time we learned X, Y, Z, and these are the things we should keep. You know, some people are talking about virtual classes still, right? Or the dialogue around systemic racism and the action around it. But what would you say in each of your respects? And that's to everyone, all the panelists.
I'll go first. Excuse me. I think in terms of the topic that I presented on, one of the things that I'm hopeful is that people understand that like a lot of the other social problems that we're dealing with have health ramifications. And so, you know, just to be conscious of that. With distance learning, we're seeing like an uptick in mental health problems among even young students or our college students. And so, you know, it's just, for me, it's just asking the question that if we need to address inequities in education or inequities in housing or inequities in finances, like we need to know that those are going to impact people's health. And so we need that, like that needs to be comprehensively part of the conversation, that health equity is tied to all of those things. So that's sort of one takeaway. And I think people are seeing that a little bit more because people, you know, have been advocating for pauses on evictions, and they'll say it's a health you know, like, because we need to protect their health, or we need to pause student loans because people are so stressed out. And so I just hope that that conversation remains consistent. And then for me, I think the last presentation by Jennifer, I think was really helpful because I've been trying to learn more ways to make teaching or even meeting with students like accessible. The fact that we might not have to be face-to-face, but also encouraging like not only doing Zoom calls, but let's call each other, and I'm gonna walk and you're walking at the same time, so we can like multitask in that way, and just being a little bit more creative there. I'm still learning, so that was a great presentation, but definitely those are some things I'm thinking.
I'd like to add that we, and to Dr. Pirtle's point, this pandemic is starting to expose a lot of the disparities that the folks that are experiencing them already knew that they were there, but I think it's putting it front and center, and to not assume access, not assume our students have the same levels of access to things like technology and housing. And one thing that I didn't mention in my slides was to cover a financial shock. The amount of hours that an individual would have to work to get to $400 is obviously a lot different for folks that make over $60,000 versus minimum wage. So we need to consider those things in our discussions with students. And if a student comes to you with a hardship, specifically with technology, I think there's an assumption that Gen Z they are connected all the time, but they don't necessarily have reliable internet or reliable transportation, or, you know, there's a lot of assumptions in that dealing with access. So just to take the student at face value, every student, and don't make assumptions on what type of access that they actually have.
This is such a good question, and it's really hard because I think, especially in public health, I think sometimes we just think negative, you know, and I think this is like a chance to sort of tap into, I mean, I think sort of what's already been mentioned, just sort of the kind of the awareness of inequities. You know, I think what's unfortunate is that there's the awareness, and I think we're still to be seen if that's translating into significant structural changes. But certainly, I think, and particularly when it comes to a lot of different workers, there's a recognition of how interconnected we are. And I think that's an area of awareness that's been really important. That, like, over the summer when the air quality was awful and the pandemic was raging, but people are still out like picking fruits and vegetables that we eat, I think there was a recognition of like, oh, those, you know, broadly across society, of like, we need those workers to be healthy so that we can all continue to eat. Again, I don't know if it's necessarily translated into the changes that it needs to, but it's an incredible starting point. I think specifically related to immigrant communities, this often happens when you do work on immigrant health. There's just an incredible amount of resilience that exists in terms of communities who are essentially excluded from many aspects of sort of formal mechanisms of the safety net and formal different types of support. You see community networks that develop systems for passing the word about, you know, resources. And I think those are things that we should continue to invest in. As much as I advocate for policies to include immigrants, I don't think policies that extend charity are necessarily needed. It's policies that continue to kind of invest in the development of those communities themselves, so that there's economic stability and kind of overall social thriving, because we can see that, I think it's the same with students. There's just so much strength coming from the people who are struggling the most. And so investing in those communities, I think, is critical.
Awesome. Thank you all for those insightful answers. We've got a question here in the chat from Kathy, which says, I know we don't want to delay graduations for our students, but do we ever advise that students should consider taking less courses to reduce stress and the cognitive load they are carrying just for the time being? What would be the pros and cons of helping students make decisions to stay engaged versus potentially dropping out?
I think I'm probably, somewhat unqualified to really answer this question. But I have a sister who is in college right now, and so I've been like telling her what advice I would give her. I don't know, I think some students at other universities that are usually the universities in and of themselves have more means than the student body do. They're able to do things like take a gap year. And I don't think that our students have all of that flexibility sometimes to do so. I would encourage someone taking 12 credits versus 20 credits for sure. I would also encourage a student to sort of take note about what classes they feel like they really need that face-to-face and what other ones might be more doable right now. I always encourage students to take fun classes throughout their time on campus. So maybe they want to teach, like teachers have been doing really cool things teaching dance ensemble. So why not take that this semester when you're overwhelmed? You know, so I would just encourage students to be a bit creative. And in that way, but I don't know, that's a tough one. I would say like yes to like try to figure out what they need and what timeline they're on, and if there are ways to like maybe push away harder classes for a time where we're hoping we're back face to face. But I didn't encourage my sister to pause her education because there wasn't a lot of other options for her. It's hard to find a job. She doesn't have transportation. Being in classes actually gives her people to talk to, and she would have been isolated. So for a lot of reasons, like fully pulling out is not really, it wasn't accessible for her. And I don't know that it's super accessible for our students either.
So I do know that if students, you know, we all know, right? If students graduate on time, they're more likely to find a career type job or a higher paying job, and then they're going to make exponentially more money because of their degree. So I know graduation is always, our grad rate is always in the back of our minds. But I agree that full-time or more is one thing. You know, if we're talking 12 units versus 18 or 20, then that's definitely something that we should have encourage students to consider. But if we're talking less than 12, there definitely is an impact on financial aid. And considering that 64% of our students are taking getting Pell Grant, there could be an impact on their financial aid, and students know that. They know 12 is like the magic number, the minimum that they can go, unless they're gonna, before they start reducing the aid that they get, and they could potentially still get charged full-time fees. So I think that's why we're seeing a lot of students still kind of stick it out and try to take 12. I also want to echo the sentiment of redistributing those difficult classes. So if you can, you know, maybe just take one per semester or a couple per semester versus loading them all into a difficult semester that's already challenging because of all of these things that they have to overcome with COVID financially, that would be a good decision. But yeah, I think for our students specifically, if they dropped completely out and they received a minimum wage job, I wonder what the likelihood of them coming back would be, because they're usually relying on their financial aid as a means of support, and that's more than they could possibly earn if they were making minimum wage.
Thank you all for that. We have another question in the chat from Ashley, which says, from this pandemic, we have seen all those needs and inequities come to light. Who has the power to address these needs? How do we advocate for others, especially if our job functions don't directly impact others to help, but we want to help?
I can jump in on just some really, the governor's budget comes out at the end of the year, and then the state legislature will be, you know, engaging in different, you know, kind of proposing bills. I mean, I think that this is a time to be connected to who your representatives are within the state. Unfortunately, our situation, the federal level is, I'm not going to comment on, because I just don't know. I mean, I haven't checked my news in like the last 2 hours, so who knows what's going on right now. But I think that I know that within UC Merced, we are really connected to like our local state representatives, kind of trying to spread the word about work that we're doing here at the university. And so I think that in the next 6 months in the next legislative cycle, there is an opportunity for just folks to be calling and bugging their state reps, based on different bills that are being put forward. The state is going to have probably a budget shortfall, and so there's going to be debates around kind of how to use our limited resources. And I think it's actually important for all of us to have a voice. I think that's a short-term solution, though. I think longer term, we're seeing now with different social movements really taking very strong shape and different economic needs. It's important for everyone to find different ways to be involved and advocating for issues that matter to them. And I forgot to put in the chat earlier, our policy brief from our study. So that this is like an example of something we've been distributing now to policymakers to sort of bring attention to some of these issues. So I'll share it with you guys in the chat.
I can jump in briefly and just maybe take Dr. Young's comments a little more localized. One of the things that I've really been so inspired at seeing is how many sort of local homegrown initiatives have been coming. It might be premature to sort of announce, but I will share one such example is that as we saw kind of the funding that was coming across the campus to help various constituencies, we recognized that the CARES Act funding obviously didn't apply to our staff. And so with Staff Assembly, we've collaborated and I'm announcing it, but there's no money in it yet. But we have a staff catastrophic emergency fund, and it's only called catastrophic because of tax implications. So we have developed a fund where we can help our own. And so to your question, Ashley, it's, being able to donate to those things and help those who we knew weren't covered from what was coming in from the government was really important. And so solutions like that, you always can come to me in my office, and if I don't know how to do it, I will know how to make it happen and at least be a partner with you in that. And that's such one example. And so when that announcement does come out, I encourage you all just to spread the word and generate some excitement about that, because as Shara was talking about, financial impacts, right, not only impact our students, they're impacting faculty, staff, postdocs, and local community. So
I love that our campus is doing that. And I wanted to, that actually goes to note, I wanted to just note something that I know we just had our election that just passed, but I want to remind everyone that you vote every single day with every dollar that you spend. So if you want to make an impact, especially in your local economy and local community, support small businesses, support the causes that, and support the businesses that support humans, human rights, animal rights, nourish the land. We really look at the businesses that you're supporting with more of a critical eye, because that is probably our strongest pull as individuals, because it's something that we can do on a daily basis. So I want to remind everyone to vote with their dollar, and we are all culpable in transforming the systems that created these inequities in the first place. And one of the fastest ways to get folks' attention is with our dollars.
Absolutely. Thanks, Shara. And Danya, I don't know if you had information on the question that was in the chat about the Giving to UCM call that's coming, if they can give to the catastrophic fund.
yeah, I'll actually drop the link in the chat and you can be the first donation. So it's live, you can donate. And so you heard it here first. So yes, you can.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And that's our time. We've got a minute left. I wanted to thank our panelists so much for offering up their expertise and time to really kind of round out our virtual dialogue. This was the last of our series for this semester. As always, for those of you who have attended in the past, you'll receive an email to fill out a survey and to also suggest topics for the upcoming spring semester. We really enjoy connecting with our campus community, and thank you all for joining us. And we'll hopefully virtually see you all soon. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Hala and Danya.
Thank you, Danya. This has been wonderful.
Desiree and
Take care,
whoever.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good day.